Good evening and welcome. My name is Laura Brower-Hagood. I am the Executive Director of the DC History Center, and we are just so pleased to present tonight's program, These Streets, Comparing the Uprisings of 1968 and Today, as part of our Context for Today series. We are also just thrilled to offer ASL interpretation of tonight's program, and if you need ASL interpretation, just pin our interpreter. In 2018, just a few years ago, a broad coalition of community organizations came together to mark the 50th anniversary of the events of 1968 with a year-long series of programs, performances, and exhibitions. As we collectively reflected on the events that had changed our city so dramatically, we realized that not enough had changed in 50 years. So many of the societal challenges and systemic racism we faced then are still very much with us today. We are here tonight because when Washingtonians took to the streets after the brutal murder of George Floyd, many invoked the events of 1968 and asked whether there's something to be learned from the comparison. And yeah, there is a lot to say about this. So tonight we will do what the DC History Center does best, which is bring together historians and community leaders to help us grapple with how the past has shaped our present. Before we start, I want to thank the many members and donors who are joining us this evening. We are planning a reopening the week after Labor Day with more details to come. And it is thanks to your extraordinary philanthropic support that we've been able to provide Zoom conversations like these while our physical doors at least were closed. So I'm going to introduce tonight's speakers, Kyla Sommers and Tony Gittens. Kyla is the digital engagement editor at American Oversight, and she earned a PhD in American history from George Washington University after writing her dissertation, I Believe in the City, the Black Freedom Struggle and the 1968 Civil Disturbances in Washington, D.C. Tony is founder and director of the Washington, D.C. International Film Festival. He served 3 mayors as executive director of the D.C. Commission on the Arts and Humanities. In addition to his many awards, Tony has firsthand knowledge of tonight's topic from his time as a student at Howard University. We're leaving a good amount of time for your questions at the end, which you can send us as they occur to you via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kyla and Tony, thank you for being with us tonight, and the microphone is yours.
We want to thank you guys and want to thank getting to meet my good friend Kyla, and we become buddies now, working on this and talking about this incredible subject. Want to thank Maggie and Laura and Jane and all the good folks there. We're looking forward to an exciting evening.
I second all of that. One of the really cool things about this is that I actually wrote about Tony in my dissertation. And so to get to talk to him about the things I had written about and his experiences was probably the most rewarding, lasting part of this. So very excited to be here. Thank you to Tony and the DC Historical Society. I'm going to start off the evening by giving kind of the more traditional history background, and then Tony is going to discuss his more personal experience and the insights that gives. I'm going to cover 3 things. First is the longer term context that led into 1968. Second, the history of what happened in 1968, specifically April. And then finally, what we can learn through the comparisons, but also the differences of 1968 and June and continuing on throughout 2020. So first, a little background. I could have done centuries of background for this since it's a short program. Bear with me when I make it much shorter and leave a lot of things out for the sake of time. But, oh, sorry, my notes disappeared. Black Washingtonians had organized in protests for many years to end discrimination in housing, job opportunities, education, and to gain access to both public and private spaces, and much more. By the 1960s, they had scored many victories, but it was clear that there was a huge roadblock to further progress: DC's lack of home rule. The DC House and Senate committees, largely filled with Southern segregationists, ruled DC with the backing and support of the Board of Trade and a close relationship with the DC police. Many activists, including Julius Hobson and Marion Barry, identified an overarching enemy: businesses that exploited Black people in their neighborhoods, and were also members of the Board of Trade that was one of the biggest opponents of home rule and community. So with that in mind, let's discuss Palm Sunday weekend 1968. The news broke that Martin Luther King had been shot at 7:30 p.m. on Thursday, April 4th. People quickly started to gather at the intersections of 14th and U Streets Northwest. This was a very important intersection for Black Washingtonians for a couple of reasons. First, this was a major bus intersection where buses that went from across town from west to east and then also from south to north intersected. So it was a place that a lot of people would have been switching over as part of their commutes home. Second, it was a central business district for Black Washingtonians. So if you were grabbing something to eat or anything else on your way home, it's likely you would have already been there. And then it was also the nerve center for civil rights organizations, including the DC branches of the NAACP, SNCC, and CORE. 14th and U is also where the headquarters of the DC headquarters of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were located. The SCLC is a civil rights organization that Dr. King founded. People gathered outside the 14th and U office hoping someone from the SCLC would give them more information. That news came at roughly 8:20 p.m. when the news broke that King had died. According to reporters there at the scene, and I'm sure Tony can add to this, the initial shock quickly evolved into bitterness and rage. Activist Stokely Carmichael, who was widely considered to be the founder of Black Power and had moved to DC earlier that year, went door to door asking businesses to close in honor of King. As he did, the crowd behind him continued to grow until it spanned over a block. Eventually, despite efforts by Carmichael and others to contain the crowd, isolated instances of window breaking snowballed into looting and some fires along the 14th Street corridor. Police eventually restored calm to the streets in the wee hours of Friday, April 5th. The next day, many people went to work as normal, thinking everything had been restored. The conventional wisdom was that civil disturbances only broke out at night, but that turned out to be wrong. By Friday afternoon, over 200 fires were burning simultaneously, and over 500 were set that day. By 10 p.m., 14th Streets Northwest, 7th Street Northwest, and H Street Northeast were all burning for a solid mile. And you can see in this image, the most consistently red are going to be 14th Street, 7th, and H, but you can also see that there's more isolated instances scattered throughout the city. On Friday, the DC police were clearly outmatched, and so President Lyndon Johnson called in the National Guard, and Mayor Walter E. Washington instituted a state of emergency that established a curfew and other restrictions on things like the sale of inflammatory substances and guns. Saturday was still hectic, but much less so than Friday, and things began to return to quote unquote normal on Sunday, which was also Palm Sunday. After that Sunday, the curfew gradually got shorter and shorter until the state of emergency was totally lifted on April 15th. The last troops left on April 16th. I know that that's a very brief overview, and one thing that's difficult about making it short is there's so many human elements that are left out of that story. I'm going to talk about them more in the comparison, but I'm hoping that that bare bones accounts can give some important context before we make some comparisons. So first, a couple of differences from 1968 and 2020. First, the scale of 1968 was much bigger than 2020. And I don't say that to discount the very big importance of the protests that are still ongoing, but in terms of the number of participants over a short amount of time, the amount of damage done, if that's one way that you want to compare them, is just a very big, it's a big difference in magnitude. So in 1968, the city endured $33 million in property damage, which is $238 million today. 1,352 businesses were harmed. Nearly 5,000 people were displaced from their jobs, and 2,000 people were left homeless. Over 4,000 people were arrested, and over 13,000 federal troops were deployed to the city. And if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is just one of many images, but it shows you the imposing presence of just a few troops. So if you can only imagine 13,000 throughout the District of Columbia. Over 500 fires were set in a single day, and tens of thousands participated in the uprisings in some way. Across every measure in terms of arrests, participants, troop presence, 1968 was just far bigger. And I think it's important to note how many similarities in terms of tactics used to discredit protesters are still used today, even when the scale of it is much less. Second, the location and targets of demonstrators and participants. In 1968, the majority of damage was done to white-owned small businesses in Black neighborhoods that many believed exploited the community. Most of the owners of these small businesses did not live in the neighborhood that their stores were. One of the reasons the recovery took so long was that many businesses never came back because they were slow or they were disinterested in the community. Some housing was damaged, but with almost, I think it's only 8 exceptions out of quite a few, this was housing above businesses that was not intended to be damaged. The uprisings did not center on federal buildings or even local government ones. And that's not to say that people weren't upset at those sources of power, but the places that the demonstrations were targeted were not those places. In 2020, the core of the protests was around the White House and the monumental core, including sometimes Congress. There's obvious exceptions for some shopping districts, but almost all of the stores damaged were large corporate chains downtown. There's also many similarities though. First, critics used very similar tactics to discredit the protesters and the protests of systemic racism that both events presented. Even though the majority of participants were not violent in both instances, and regardless that such protests are a long-standing part of American history, much of the national conversation centered around looting, setting fires, and other acts of violence in both 1968 and 2020. This tactic serves to avoid the needed conversations about police brutality, racism, and other inequalities. Second, both 1968 and 2020 built upon previous activism and long-standing grievances. These events weren't a coordinated conspiracy, but people were not called to act or demonstrate solely by the death of King or George Floyd. Years of grievances and the failure of leaders to adequately respond to their demands and activism were the tinder the matches of King and Floyd's death ignited. Third, the response of police and the military were hotly debated in both 68 and 2020. Conservative leaders demanded, both in 1968 and 2020, that, quote, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, while others were appalled at the displays of militarism and power and brutality on the streets. It's important to note that in 1968, as the local response in 2020 was considered to be milder or more restrained than other places across the nation. In 1968, that meant that there were very few instances of guns being fired. However, there were thousands of cans of canisters of tear gas used. In 2020, the DC police were seen as somewhat better than the federal troops and agents that were on the streets, often unidentified, but there was criticism of those forces as well. It was more of a, in comparison, they were perhaps considered better. Fourth, it's important to remember that many people experience the events in different ways, both in 68 and today. For the scary images of police patrolling streets, there's this image, and if you can go to the next one, which is a monumental traffic jam. For many who didn't live in the damaged neighborhoods, the biggest problem for them was a massive traffic jam when they drove to their suburban or far north homes Friday afternoon. For many, the events were scary. For others, they were filled with grief at the death of King. For others, they were joyous, as the feeling of rebelling against oppressor brought. For many, they were all of these things at the same time. And I think one of the great elements of conversation I saw about the 2020 protests was this idea that you could be enraged and joyful at the same time, or be demonstrating grief, but also other emotions and other ways of demonstrating that all at the same time. Next, many people volunteered to try and help others during the time of crisis. In '68, people went to courthouses to help loved ones find those arrested. Lawyers went to represent those arrested. And many people, including Howard students, set up food banks and ways to help people who've been displaced from their jobs find new ones. I think a lot about the parallel with people donating to bail funds today, and all the other ways that people brought food or water or even masks to the protests in 2020 to try and help out others. And next, life continued even in the time of crisis. If you'll go to the next slide, this is a woman going to church on Palm Sunday. You can see that her and her daughter are dressed in their Sunday best, even as they walk past all the rubble. And then the next slide is, this is actually from 2020, and this is ironically Le Diplomat, which was previously a business that was damaged in 1968, and then with gentrification has become a French restaurant. But you can see people dining outside amidst boarded up windows. Finally, there are similarities in that there are competing narratives of the events. In 1968, you had the story of Richard Nixon's election and law and order and the beginning of mass incarceration as a response to the nationwide uprisings. But that's just part of the story. Just as today, you have President Trump claiming that also reprising a lot of the ideas of law and order, and that we need to be tougher on protesters and tougher on crime, and pushing Operation Legend, where so many people, where federal agents are being deployed to American cities in response to, they claim to be in response to crime. But you also have a different story at the local level. Local activists seized the message of the uprising to work to make important changes in DC, including home rule, police reform, community control, and input in the Reconstruction Plan, with a big emphasis on low-income housing and job for neighborhood residents. And I know that Tony is going to talk more about this legacy. The local solutions were often constrained by federal policies, but we can still find hope in the determination of Washington leaders and everyday citizens who were determined to listen to the message of the uprisings and solve the problems that the people identified as they demonstrated. Thank you.
Kyla, that's great. I learned a lot when I listened to you, so thanks so much. The 1960s had the most widespread series of urban uprisings in the history of the United States. Major disturbances occurred in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, New York City in 1964, Watts in 1965, and Chicago in 1966. In 1967 alone, Tampa, Florida, Cincinnati, Ohio, Atlanta, Georgia, Newark, Plainfield, and New Brunswick, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan all had uprisings. Disturbances erupted in more than 110 US cities on April 4th, the night Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. People were being killed, millions of dollars in property were being destroyed, giving centuries of discrimination. Black people were angry. In March 1968, I was one of hundreds of Howard University students who marched into the Howard Administration Building. We vowed to stay there until the university met our demands for a Black university focused on serving the interests of the Black community. It was 1 month before the assassination of Dr. King. In the 1960s, Dr. King was the most prominent Black leader in the country. He heroically demonstrated and was jailed many times under the banner of nonviolent protests. However, A more activist attitude was rising among Black youth who were calling for Black pride and self-determination, for Black power. Can I have the slide, please? First slide for me. Motivated by the demonstrations taking place around the country and the cry for Black power, the Howard student takeover of 1968 was the first major expression of the Black Power movement in Washington, D.C. After months of futile discussions of university administrators, the militant students just stopped the school from operating. Administrators finally agreed to the student demand, and Howard has never been the same. The protests attracted the support of the Washington community at large. They saw it as a break from the apathetic past and an example of how Black activism could get results. This was the same community that aggressively protested when Dr. King was killed a month later. Next slide, please. I don't remember when we heard that Dr. King had been shot and that people had taken to the streets in protest. There were no cell phones or internet at that time. I suspect television or radio were how we got the news. Once we heard, I and about half dozen fellow students walked from campus to 14th Street and Columbia Road. We could smell the smoke and see the fires burning as we moved along. Once we entered 14th Street, we saw chaos. Young Black men were breaking store windows and hauling away store merchandise. People were blowing car horns. Most people were just hanging around the streets, yelling at the police. My clearest memory is of a police van with its red light blinking and its back door open. The police was standing, looking from side to side with no obvious sense of what to do. Next thing I knew, my friend John Jones was being pushed into the back of the van. QT Jackson, another friend, touched the policeman's arm, trying to explain that John had done nothing wrong. A policeman behind him hit QT on the head with his baton. We surrounded QT and pushed him away from the policeman who was going toward another protester. John jumped out of the van and we made our way down 14th Street to observe what was happening around us. Much of the rest of that night is a blur to me. I know we were on the streets most of the night, but did not want anything to do with the police. The efforts at stopping the looting were totally futile. The following morning, I returned to campus where students had organized a very peaceful demonstration. One side read, "When you killed Martin Luther King, you killed America." We took down the American flag from the center of the campus and replaced it with a red, black, and green Black unity flag. The next slide, please. The next night, I was back out on the streets. Looting started early, and I watched as a group tore off the gate of a pawn shop and stripped it clean, including its firearms. The following night, I'd walked along 14th Street with Carl Blois, a journalist friend. On U Street, with the exception of Ben's Chili Bowl, all of the stores were shuttered. Officials tried to keep students in school, but failed. Ministers and community leaders tried to get people to go home, to no avail. Similar rebellions broke out in other cities. President Johnson made a national television speech, but was ignored. Looting and demonstrations continued for several more nights. Hundreds were arrested. Though understandable, the type of urban rebellion we saw in 1968 was a terrible thing. People got injured and killed. Homes and businesses were destroyed. After the army was brought in, The city was occupied by primarily young white soldiers from Maryland and Virginia. It looked like we were in a war zone, as you can see from this photo. Please go to the next slide. But Black people were not burning down their neighborhoods. They were burning down dilapidated housing and businesses that had exploited them for years. Their owners took their money to their comfortable homes in the suburbs. There had been centuries of racial discrimination in Washington. It wasn't as though upon hearing of Dr. King's murder, Black people just went to the streets and started destroying the city. Anger and rage had been building in these communities for decades. Dr. King's murder was the last straw. Please go to the next slide. Let's jump to 2020. Film of the police killing of George Floyd was repeatedly broadcast on television news. Compared to 1968, the looting and property damage in 2020 were very limited. Demonstrations and looting started in downtown Washington with confrontations with police in front of the White House. I stayed home. In this time of coronavirus, I did not want to risk being among thousands of people without masks and not practicing social distancing. However, the next day on television, I watched as thousands of young protesters walking down 16th Street on their way to the White House. I had to join them. I had to go. My wife drove me to DuPont Circle, where I had early seen a gathering of protesters. I planned to stand in the back, away from the crowd, and watch. It was an LGBTQ demonstration in support of Black Lives Matter. I walked from DuPont Circle to Scott Circle, and then along 16th Street to K Street. I stayed as close to the walls as possible, away from groups of people. It seemed as though I was the oldest person there. There were tables selling t-shirts, requests to sign petitions, and folks having picnics on lawns in front of apartment buildings. A flatbed truck cruised along playing dance music. But the vast majority of people were there for business. Speakers blast, "What do you want? Justice. When do you want it? Now," over and over again. I was surprised by how many of the protesters were white, Asian, and Latino. I had never seen such a diverse crowd of protesters before. One of the young white men had a sign that read, "Stop killing my friends." I stood on that corner for at least 30 minutes, and the flow of people never stopped. I wanted to join them at the White House, but was concerned about getting the virus. As I walked back to my home in Adams Morgan, I saw a number of young Black and white people with signs on their way to the protests. Like Kyla, I've been asked what I see as the difference between the rebellions in 1968 and 2020. As I mentioned, in 1968, we did not have cell phones or the internet. Our son asked how we started movements without Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, platforms that made the same work so much faster. My wife told him about the old mimeograph machine, where you typed out your announcement, cranked it out by hand, and handed out the leaflets on the corner. My son laughed. My wife pointed out that doing things the slow way gave us time to talk, strategize, and bond. Another difference is the street protesters in 1968 were almost all Black men and women. The protests in 2020 were integrated for their support for Black Lives Matter. In 1986, In 1968, much of the damage was done in Black areas along 14th Street, 8th Street, etc. Police and the Army blocked off uptown and downtown as best they could. In 2020, most of the damage was done downtown. There was much less property damage and loss in 1968. In 1968, there were similar demonstrations in scores of US cities. In 2020, demonstrations took place all over the world. Some of the similarities: both rebellions were ignited by a white man killing an unarmed Black man. Both demonstrations involved confrontation with the police. In 2020, Donald Trump even used police to brutally remove peaceful demonstrators so he could have a photo op. This is reminiscent of how police attacked peaceful demonstrators in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. Both uprisings were the result of a long history of discrimination towards Black people, as Kyla also mentioned. Neither 1968 or 2020 had an identifiable leader. The movements came from the people. Both were primarily carried out by young Black men. Both resulted in a greater awareness of Americans' race problem. Please go to the next slide. I would like to say a few words about Black Power and Drum and Spear Bookstore, another slice of Washington's history. Some people associate Black Power with Black anger. Drum and Spear Bookstore and its parent company, Afro-American Resources, exemplify Black empowerment and institution building. The Drum and Spear Bookstore opened spring 1968 on 14th and Irving Street, the heart of the rebellion-torn city. It was a place to find books about African and Afro-American life not then available elsewhere. We also had Drum and Spear Press, a radio program, African Art Import Business Education Center, and news service. This was our expression of Black Power. In closing, I would like to point out the most troubling similarity between 1968 and 2020. And that is the challenged living conditions of so many people in Washington, D.C. Just as in 1968, the 14th and U Street restaurants and shops are not owned by Black people. Now, not even the houses in that area are owned by the Black people who used to call that area home. White families fled to the suburbs in the 60s and 70s. Now, ironically, their children and grandchildren have returned to the city because of the vibrancy of urban life. And what is most painful and upsetting is the unchanged conditions for young Black children in our poorest neighborhoods. They had it hard in 1968, and they still have it hard today. The poverty, the isolation, the hopelessness, the conditions that helped create the uprising in 1968 are much the same in 2020. Petty crime, teenage gangs with guns shooting each other and anyone who gets in their way. Young girls having children they are not ready to nurture. An educational system that has not figured out how to properly educate them. Unemployment, underemployment, police harassment. These are the same conditions that spawned the anger in 1968 as well as 2020. We live in the richest country in the world, in one of the wealthiest regions in the United States, and we have not yet been able to resolve this basic humanitarian problem. We should not be surprised if 1968 and 2020 happen again.
So I think now we're planning on asking each other some questions before it's opened up to audience questions. Tony, if you want to go first, you can, or I have a question too.
Okay. First of all, I want to point out that handsome young man in the photo is me. Many years ago, as you could tell, I put on a few years, but that's when I weighed about 20 or 30 pounds. Those days are over. Kyla, I got to say, I was fascinated by your presentation, the amount of detail, the amount of history, the amount of research you've brought to it. Just has created this background from which all of the demonstrations, the protests, the peaceful protests have come. But I would like to know, do you think that the uprisings can change traditional history and narrative? Do you think that by digging into the specifics and the history and the personal reports of people who were facing that and lived through that, do you think that amount of detail can change the narrative, the public narrative, how people have been thinking, especially of '68?
I hope so. One thing that has been really interesting is I feel like as we are watching so many widespread demonstrations and protests, that so many people have made comparisons to '68, that it's actually given space to talk about the legacy of '68. And people are pushing back against some of the legacies that I think have some truth, but are also problematic. So one thing that I really wanted to talk about when I wrote my dissertation was that, we've had so many historians write books about the white backlash in suburbs and by people like Richard Nixon and the legacy of law and order. And there's almost sometimes this implication that, people tore up their own cities and then they were rightfully punished for it, or they went too far. And so the white backlash, that's just what happened. And I think one thing that DC in '68 and the aftermath is so important is because it allows, DC was governed by Black people. After Mayor Washington came in, the majority of the city council was Black, but also a lot of activists were really pushing for reform. And so some of that narrative, there's space to challenge that narrative within DC. And you see a different legacy, that it's not just the city left in ruin who no one cared about. People were using the moment to make the district better and to really try and identify and solve the problems that had been, so clearly illuminated with the uprisings. And so I am glad to see the room for that, more room for those type of discussions happening in 2020 as a result of this. I also think that so many, I'll make it quick, but I think so many resources had primarily used police records or FBI records because of all the FBI COINTELPRO surveillance on Stokely Carmichael and other activists. And that provides some interesting detail, but it's also a very one-sided story. And I think historians for a long time, but as well as activists now, are saying that that's not enough to know the history of something. And there's been many incredible oral histories, including at the DC Historical Society, and many people like yourself who want to give the personal experience side of things so that those written documents that can be found in archives aren't the only source of information or the only narratives we give credit to.
Yeah, and I also think that in terms of this narrative, that the popular narrative about especially '68, this notion that the whole city was aflame, that the place was just burning down and Black people just burned it up and tore it up. And I really liked your map, which showed exactly where that was happening. Because, and you can correct me on this, but this is my recollection, that it didn't go beyond, on 16th Street, for example, it didn't go beyond Park Road. That when you went beyond Park Road, and I loved your photo of the woman and her child dressed up in their Sunday best with the background of the riots, but living a normal life. And most Washingtonians were not involved in the demonstrations. They just weren't. There were no GS 15s and 16s down there. you know. So this notion that the whole city was just going crazy, I think was another part of the narrative that I'm glad you're helping to correct.
Well, and I think that that's another, that the legacy of systemic racism comes in, right? For many people, white people that lived in the suburbs or, upper northwest of DC, it was a bad traffic jam, right?
Yeah,
And
right,
they were scared,
right.
I'm sure. There's definitely news reports at the time of suburban housewives flooding grocery stores, convinced that, they weren't, there was a quote that was like, it was worse than a snowstorm in DC, which all of us who live in DC know the panic that accompanies a coming snowstorm. But for others, like the woman walking to church with her child, or the 2,000 people that lost housing, it was a very big deal, and that was it really disrupted basic life for quite a while. If you needed medication, you couldn't get medication because all the pharmacies were closed or burnt. There's so many, all the food banks that opened up to help people find meals, and so many grocery stores were destroyed and not going to be open for business for quite a while. And so you see the ways that, the differences in life and different of access, access to things played out in the aftermath in ways that made the experience even more disparate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I know something that we talked about when we were meeting before this event was the idea of who is the leader. Is there
right.
Black Lives Matter doesn't have a singular leader, and in the wake of Dr. King's assassination, so many people said, "Well, who is the next leader?" And so I'm curious why you think that there are so few, if any, specific iconic Black community leaders today.
Well, I think that the issues are so many that there's no one person who could take them all on. You have guns, you have education, you have the economy, you have all kinds of discrimination, you have so many issues going on that every once in a while when the issue comes up, there is somebody who jumps forward, but there's no one that can take all of that on. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. As I mentioned before, the people are the ones who went to the street. There was no leader who said, "Okay, guys, it's over." No. The people who were out on that street doing what they were doing, we'll never know their names. We'll never know their names. And I think that's a good thing. It's a good organic thing that's happening. It happened in '68. Stokely was, as you mentioned, the iconic person in the face of Black Power. But he really didn't have any influence with the 1968 disturbances, as you outlined in your dissertation. He really didn't play that much of a role. So it's great to see that people, and I got the same feeling in 2020, that there were speeches and such, but there was no one person. And it sort of breaks with the big person, the big man, theory of history, that there's one person that is so great they get it together, and the reality is that there are many people who work and get to a point where there's some real serious social change. No one person could do it.
Definitely. That's been a big push, for historians for a long time, as you say. So it's interesting to see, Black Lives Matter as a movement, how that's represented, this idea that there's not, most of the time movements aren't built on one person.
No. I mean, it's a simple way of looking at history, but it's just not true. It's just not true. So, and I think that what we saw in 1968 and 2020 exemplifies that. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Mayor Walter Washington, who was the appointed mayor of the district at that time in 1968. And of course, we have Mayor Muriel Bowser, who is our current mayor and who I personally just love. And I wondered how you compare their performance during those experiences.
So I think there's some really interesting parallels between them. They're from the district. So I titled my dissertation, "I Believe in the City," which is a quote from Mayor Washington. And in the aftermath of '68, so many people wanted to blame what had happened on him and say, you know, DC, it's just a bad place. It's poorly run. They can't control people. You know, it's their fault. And people wanted to, you know, cut DC's funding. They wanted to permanently have it occupied by federal troops. It was really bad. And so Mayor Washington sits in front of all of, you know, the DC House Committee, and he's just being grilled. Every, you know, representative after representative is just trashing the city, trashing his leadership, saying, you know, that DC shouldn't be independent at all. And eventually Mayor Washington says, you know, everyone wants to run down DC. I recognize that there are problems, but I believe in the city and I believe in the people. And he outlines why, in the middle of all this conflict, DC deserves to be independent, DC deserves to be self-ruled, and people should have faith in DC and its people. And I think that there's some parallels with Muriel Bowser and, you know, the conflict between federal control and local politics, in that President Trump wanted, you know, where else can you have more power as a president than Washington, D.C., because we're not a state, we're not completely independent. And so he was able to send in unidentified federal agents and clear peaceful protesters for a photo op to display his power. And then, I mean, I was on the mall on July 4th and it was still barricaded and troops patrolling and, you know, military vehicles. And, you know, there's still him trying to push his message. And then I think, you know, for some of the criticism that I think Muriel Bowser can get some criticism for not maybe initially responding as strongly or some of the curfew stuff. But I do think that she has said, you know, we are independent, we deserve to be a state, and you can't control this, you can't just control DC like that, we're independent. So I think that there's more parallels, but I think that's the strongest one that I want to emphasize, is just that dealing with federal control.
And I agree that both Mayor Washington and Mayor Bowser stood for the people of their city against presidents who wanted, as you would say, express their power by just doing whatever they wanted to us. They both did what was necessary to protect us and to make sure that they were in control. As you say, they love their city as we do, and they were really great. I really have great respect for Mayor Bowser. She's calm and strong, and you know, the right person to have been there during the 2020 demonstrations.
I can ask you one more question, then I think we can turn it over to other people's questions.
Yeah.
So what do you see? I know you talked about some of the differences in terms of who was participating in 68 and 2020, but what do you see as some of the differences in the demands of activists in 68 and today, and how priorities perhaps shifted?
Well, in 68, it was just so far to go. I mean, the demands were around economics and housing and laws that needed to be passed. Out of it came, you know, things like affirmative action, greater implementation of housing. It stopped redlining housing so Black people could live wherever they wanted to live. And emotionally and psychologically, there was a boost, as people would say in this digital age. There was a boost to self-confidence and self-assurance on the part of the Black community since 1968, and the advent of the Black Power ethos of people who began to take seriously the principles of Black Power. And the movement, there are things like that were kind of subtle, like the reporters on television. There's so many more Black reporters were used because the Black protesters wouldn't talk to the white reporters. And so the editor said, well, come on, John, Frank, Sally, we need you out there. And so you got these new images, Blacks on television show programs, The Cosby Show, and so much more came out of the effort in 1968. In 2020, I'm probably not, I'm not kept up on it. What I hear is defunding the police and taking down sculptures. I'm sure that has their role and their purpose. I want to think in '68 there was a lot more to accomplish, and therefore a lot more got accomplished. I'm waiting to see how the 2020 effort sort of plays out. Is there more that could be asked? But on its own, I'll say this finally, that that seeing the diverse group of kids that were out in the street told me that they could go to their parents and say, look, you know, this race thing is crazy, it's stupid, you know, and you know, I know folks because I work with African Americans, I work with them, I've been to school, but they're the same as we are. There's some cultural differences, but bottom line, you know, people sort of want the same thing. And I think that maybe that gives me some, I don't like the word hope, but makes me think that because young people have more progressive ideas and experiences about this subject, that they're going, and as they grow up into adults, into the new America, we have a chance. We have a chance to really do something because it comes from their heart, you know, as opposed to something that people were forced to do. Like the sign said, stop killing my friends. Oh my God, you know, these people are my friends. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, really. So this has been such a great conversation. And I just want to bring in the voices of some of the participants. And as previous programs that we've had, we've got some really great questions. So right on the top of my list here is, this is for you, Tony. Can you speak a little bit more to community organizing in the lead up to the events of 1968? What was happening at the time?
There was a lot happening. Stokely Carmichael had come to DC, I can't remember from the South, I think it was in like 67 or something. Kyla would know. Kyla has the details. I don't know. But there were a number of community organizers that had come who had great experience that they had gained during their work, the SNCC people especially, their work in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. And then there were also the other folks from SCLC and these other places. But DC has this wonderful history of people who led demonstrations. Sammy Abbott, which again, Kyla can give you the details on his life. And there were just so many of these folks who went out and fought for home rule, the track system, which people don't remember in education. Julius Hobson, a great community organizer who fought and got rid of the track system. The track system was a public school policy that white kids went to track 1 and black kids went to track 2. And he got rid of that. The protests against stores that didn't hire black people, and therefore he led boycotts against them, on and on. I can go on and on, but it's a long, deep history of people who protested obvious, blatant discrimination in DC. One reason I love this city.
And so what about the issues at Howard specifically? What were you and your fellow students really focused on kind of in those years?
Howard was considered probably the top African American university, black university. But the folks there were living in the past. They were paternalistic, they were elitist, and they touted themselves as the black Harvard University. And we just felt that no, there should be a black university. There should be a black curriculum. Subjects like architecture should be also increasingly about how to improve housing for black people. The med school should have programs that sent doctors to Africa and such, but the university as an educational institution should give that as its focus, that should be, it should not strive to be like the best of the white universities. It should strive to be the best of black universities, because that's why it was created. We were there, and that's why we came there. And it's another one of these examples of years of trying to be reasonable with people. You know, we would meet with them and argue with them. Committees were formed, you know, and they just kept doing what they were going to do. And they put me out. I was expelled twice. Yeah, twice. They put me out, they brought me back, and then they were getting ready to put me out again.
Some serious cred there.
Well, I don't know about that, you know, but they just did things that were just so insulting and treating you as children that we just said, forget it, we'll shut it down. And we shut it down. We shut it down. We shut it down. And the place has never been the same. The television station came out of that. The radio station came out of that. A whole lot of scholarship came out of that. It's never been the same. Hopefully it will not return to its old ways.
Wow. Fascinating. This kind of brings us into the present. Tony, you mentioned that the decline in Black home ownership in the kind of the neighborhoods that were affected by the uprisings of 1968. And of course, the disparities in income and wealth by race and class have only increased since the 1960s. You brought up the issue of gentrification. How do you see that being resolved?
Big
question.
It should never have happened. All right, I don't know how to resolve it. What I know is that, and I've had conversations with people who lived in that area, they resent it. A guy told me this, I've been born and raised in Washington. This is not the Washington I know. Now, can it be changed and go back to it? I don't know. I don't know. All I'm here to report is that people don't like it. You know, they resent it. It's the same old thing. We're back to where we were. And it's that resentment that smolders and can come and ignite the kinds of behavior that we saw in 1968 and 2020. People just don't like it. How to change it around? I know Mayor Bowser is trying to push for more affordable housing. I can't say, but I can tell you it's a problem.
Do you think that was some of the energy?
Schools, I can't tell you what to do about the schools. You know, but I know it's a problem. I mean, I could tell you, I know because I've been in the schools. I used to do programs in the schools. It's a problem. Yeah. It's a problem. They got to find a way to deal with it, or it's going to happen, continue to happen.
So do you think that was part of the energy behind the Black Lives Matters demonstrations that we just saw?
Yes.
Are those two connected? Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes. When with cell phones now, you know, where people are able to take video, such as when Mr. Floyd was killed by the police. You see that, and you begin to wonder about all those times the police sort of harassed you, the obvious unfairness about it. Will this policeman get away with this? No, we can't let him get away with it. The people that you know who have been turned away for jobs and houses, and it all sort of comes to you and you say, God, I'm just not going to stand for this anymore. You know, I'm just not, if I have an opportunity, I'm going to do something about it, you know, and that view that's driven by, as Kyla has pointed out, years of discrimination. It doesn't just happen like that, you know, it's built up. And when that resentment is there, that anger is there, it has to show up somewhere. Could
I just add something to that real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm not going to claim to have solutions either, but I just would contextualize it. I would add what I can offer from a historical contextualization perspective, which is in the aftermath of 1968, one of the priorities for Reconstruction was low-income housing, but not, that it would be beautiful low-income housing that would serve the communities, and the communities would plan it, and the communities would build it, and it was going to be built by partnerships between community groups, many of which were churches, and the DC government. And it was this truly, I think, incredible plan that was meant to share the incredible resources of urban living with the people that had lived there for so long and put all of their resources into the community. Unfortunately, federal funding, Nixon slashed the housing and urban development funding, and a lot of those projects, they eventually decided to go with private funding instead and let private developers develop. What that meant is it wasn't profitable to develop then, so they waited, or they only built luxury apartments. And then when the metro opened, which is incredible, but it also meant only 3 Black businesses survived both the 1968 and the metro construction in the U Street area. And so then whenever, all of a sudden it was really desirable for many people's perspective, it was then and only then desirable to live there. And businesses opened up, and the Walter Reed Center opened it up, and all the luxury housing started. But the people that had been there through 68, the people that had been there through the dark days of the metro construction, no longer got the benefit of their community, and they're being displaced. So I think there was this vision of how to rebuild the U Street corridor that would have shared the benefits, with long-term residents and been driven by long-term residents. But that was rejected by the federal government in favor of private developers, and we are still seeing the consequences of that.
Can I add one more thing?
Mm-hmm.
And not everyone is going to agree with me on this. Marion Barry did a lot to build the Black middle class in this city. So he gave people jobs, and once you have a job, you can buy a home, you can take care of your family, get health insurance and all that. And so he began to employ so many Black people in the city in jobs that normally would not have gone to them. And what this has meant is that if you want to, now you're capable, if you want to buy a home on 14th and U Street, and you might have the chance to have the money to deal with that, the background, the security in your own financial life to be able to get a loan to do that. Maybe that's the way to do it. And Marion gets so much of a bad rap. Marion wasn't fascinated by management and bureaucracy. He was devoted to Black people and wanting to do the best he could to make their lives better. And that kind of approach has helped a lot of people.
All right, so the questions are starting to accumulate, so I'm going to try to move through some of these a little bit more quickly. Could you talk a bit about ways non-white and/or allied business owners show their support for the uprising? This is an anonymous attendee, but he or she remembers hearing about the Soul Brother and Black-owned business signs and wonders what it was like on the ground.
In 68?
Yeah.
Yes, I watched a white restaurant owner play paint on the front of his boarded up window, Soul Brother, because and there was at some point, but I don't know about the first thing, but by the second night, the demonstrators were getting selective. They would say no. Either that person is one of us, he's African American, or he's run a business that has been supportive of the community. So that was a real thing that actually happened.
Kyla, this was probably part of your research too.
Yeah, so I was going to mention that beyond Soul Brother, one of the interesting parallels, I think, if we all imagine or if we all remember in 2020, how many emails we got from companies saying Black Lives Matter or announcing some oftentimes half-hearted initiative to suddenly, or I'm being pretty cynical, which maybe gives a little bit a hint of, but to often say like, here's this initiative that we're doing. We've always cared about racism, but at a very specific time. One of the things that I found in my research in 68 was ads in newspapers where so many companies would place ads saying in remembrance of Dr. Martin Luther King. And this was most of them in advance of Dr. King's funeral. And there was this theory that the biggest uprising was going to be on the day of King's funeral. And stores would put photos of Kings in their windows. They had all these advertisements and like very empty rhetoric. But this idea that, oh, this is a big deal. How do we get ahead? Like, how do we maintain our profits or seem like we're on the right side as a business? And so, you know, for all those emails that you got in 2020, there were newspaper ads in 1968.
Fascinating. This one's from Bob. If Washington had true home rule, which it didn't have in 1968 and still doesn't have, would the protests in either year have been any different? That's a big question.
I don't think so. I don't think so. The issues were, I think, beyond what a congressman and a senator could really resolve. I mean, there are those issues about the poor, the kids, especially the kids in our poorest communities, and what the life they lead, the suffering, you know, the environment they're in. Can they ever grow out of that? I'm not sure if home rule is going to make a big, and I see home rule coming, by the way, but I'm not sure that it's going to make that big a difference. It's something else that's going to make a difference. I'm not sure that's, maybe Kyla has a different thought on it.
Yeah.
I think in 1968, many people had identified that the continuation of congressional rule was a very big exacerbating problem for a lot of the issues that Washingtonians faced. The first election that Washingtonians presidential elections that they could vote in was 1964 for president. And it wasn't until 1968 that they could vote for anything like local, and that was just the school board. But the House, I mean, both the House and Senate committees were largely populated with Southern segregationists who wanted to maintain their segregationist clout by the way that they treated the district. And so it, you know, it's kind of one of those things that it was necessary but not sufficient. But there were many things that were held up by the lack of any sort of home rule. I think today it's really exciting to see the focus on statehood, and I would love nothing more. But I do think that the amount that Congress is able to limit what DC decides to do is, you know, obviously much less so than it was in 1968.
Okay. Here's question. Today's movement seems to have more of an anti-capitalist narrative than it did in 1968. Is that fair to say, Kyla?
I don't know. 68 had a lot of anti-capitalism. So in many ways, many people thought, and often not only conservatives, but often conservatives thought that Stokely Carmichael was the reason that 68 happened, not even just in DC, but sometimes nationwide. And there was there was a theory that Stokely Carmichael was getting his orders from Cuba, from Fidel Castro in Cuba. And this was to the point that there was an op-ed published in the Washington Post in 68 saying that. The FBI actually, and the Attorney General, Ramsey Clark, actually started an investigation into whether Stokely Carmichael was to blame. So there was definitely the fear that there was a very big anti-capitalist idea behind it. But no, I definitely think that if you look, you know, the people protesting, the people participating, both today and in 68, represent a wide range of perspectives. There's not one political ideology coming out of it. But the anti-capitalism was definitely a part of it. And a lot of the more radical elements definitely incorporated criticisms of capitalism. But also one of the solutions presented in the aftermath was, just as it is today, was Black capitalism. So there was definitely an internal debate between those two ideas.
There's also this incredible division of wealth in this country, perhaps in the world, but in the last few decades, it's gotten even sharper with it's become an oligarchy. It's a few people that have all this money and power, and the rest of us that, you know, don't have that amount of power. So I think that people who are anti-capitalism think that that's a way to break that up, and to have the people become more controlling and benefiting from the wealth of this country. They have their point of view. But I know
You sound pretty skeptical.
What's that?
You sound skeptical.
I am.
Yeah.
I mean, where's Bernie Sanders from Vermont or something? I don't see Vermont as this beacon on the hill of socialism that he, you know, why can't he do it at home and he wants to do it for everybody else? Thank you, Bernie, but, you know, not today, you know? So I don't see it, but I think that the people who are in charge, you know, people in the government and businesses, that they better do something about themselves about it, because eventually people are going to get pissed at that too, and they're going to come after them hard in some way. So if they have any if they have enough feeling and sensitivity to their environment, they had better do something themselves to bring themselves in, to start sharing some more of that, because people are going to start to get mad. They are. It's just unfair.
This is from Francisco. Could you elaborate on some of the protest tactics that Black activists relied on, such as sit-down strikes that targeted businesses, barricades, human chains at busy intersections?
All of that. All of that. See, the thing is, you gotta should give these people some pain. And it's not like you want to go out there. I mean, I'm not John Lewis. His courage and getting beat and coming. I'm not him. In my little finger doesn't have as much courage as that man had. So I'm not comparing that. But the principle is, you know, after you spent so much time, I mean, it's always negotiation first. You know, talking to folks, trying to, you know, this is what we want. Can we get it? This is why we. And then you find out that doesn't work. And then you got to cause them some pain. You know, you got to disrupt it some way. You got to get their attention. You have to make them, give them some cost. If they continue doing this, then it's going to hurt them in some way, and they're better off just giving you what you want and walk away. We found that at Howard. I mean, what we learned at Howard and are in the movement in general, you can't learn in a classroom. You just can't do it, especially we were kids, you know? Anyway, so you find out, you know, you're reasonable, and then you find out from people, they just sit there, and so you find different ways to cause them pain. You demonstrate, you tell people, okay, we're going to sit across the street and stop the traffic. You know, we're going to get a big rally. We're going to disrupt this meeting because we just wanted to get, and it works more than it doesn't work.
Kyla, what did you see?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to answer this by picking out different examples from several different decades, because, and it kind of fits the theme of these are long building issues and long building tactics. So in 1919, there were race riots in DC, which were predominantly white people attacking Black people. And this is one, like Tulsa, this is an example of a post-World War I race riot that they happened all over the country. And one tactic that Black people used in 1919 was armed self-defense. And that was, you know, there's been a lot written about that, but that was one tactic in 1919. In the 30s, you have the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign, which was several Black men were fired from a burger joint because they were Black and then replaced with white workers. And that was one of the first Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns, so people would boycott until they would be willing to hire Black workers. In the 40s, you have Mary Church Terrell and all of her picketing of lunch counters, but also public places, businesses that wouldn't allow Black people to shop there or eat there. And that was a really widespread campaign that was ultimately successful. And then in the 50s, you have a lot of different examples of school pushes for desegregating schools before, Brown versus Board nationwide, but I'm forgetting the name, the specific DC case. I think it's Bowling, but I'm embarrassed. but there's a push, you know, they did school boycotts, they did sit-ins as well, but it was a lot of community organizing for those. And then obviously in the 60s, you have marches, you have boycotts and protests outside of the homes of people who were enforcing segregationist housing policies. I think Tony mentions the ECTC, which was the push for not having the highway system through DC.
Yeah.
And they did a lot of protests, a lot of pretty agitative work that also included a lot of sit-ins. So it's a long, I guess the other thing I'd say is Polly Murray was a Howard student in the 40s, and she initiated lunch counter sit-ins that became a national tactic. But Howard told her she could, like they banned protests by students. So that was an example of Howard's relationship with students in the 40s. So, you know, there's long-standing tactics that had been developed and oftentimes pioneered in DC for decades leading up to the late 60s.
Are there any tactics and strategies that could be used today, or any advice that you would give to organizers or activists today?
Two things. One, I want to say that the thing about community organizing is it's a long-term struggle. That if you're going to do that, you have to dig in and give, and it's not going to happen in a day. It's a long-term struggle to get to what you want and convince people to see it the way that it really is, and really who it is that's holding them down. What was your question? I missed the, yes. I think home rule, which came up earlier, I think home rule is ready for district resident demonstration. I think that we're ready to sit in the Congress and the Senate and just embarrass them to death about it. I think that enough lawyers and enough lawyers and thinkers and writers live here in order to carry that out. I think it's insulting and silly that it's gone on this way for so long. And I think that is the issue that should cut across the board of all Washingtonians. And folks, I think, could gather themselves and go down there, and as John Lewis called it, you know, good trouble. Go down there and cause it good trouble and point out, you know, the insanity of this.
Kyla, what would you suggest?
That's tough. I think, so Julius Hobson was a very annoying in a great way. He was, Julius Hobson liked some good trouble. So a famous example is that Julius Hobson would go, he'd gather up rats from the inner city and then drive them to Georgetown and release them. I don't know if he ever actually, but he'd make a spectacle out of it and threaten to release them into Georgetown. And different, like he was a man of spectacle in a good way. But he was asked about, you know, well, what do you think of this leader who isn't as radical, or this leader who only uses these tactics? And he said, you need all of it. I can be this way because other people have different strategies. So I think, I'm not paraphrasing it well, but the point is that, you know, there needs to be a broad coalition, and they might use different tactics, and some people might, you know, be way more radical, but that all parts of that are needed to, it's a good thing to have the different types of strategies, and they, you know, they don't have to agree, and that's part of protest, and that's part of progress. I also just think of, you know, not that a commuter tax is sufficient, but I think it's a good first step. And every time protesters do anything with blocking traffic, I see a lot of people that like to think they're progressive suddenly very offended by traffic jams. So that might be a good way to cause some good trouble and get some people thinking a little bit more.
Or maybe we should release some rats in the halls of Congress.
Yeah, right.
See how that would go over.
Everything else has failed.
All of the above. This is a testimonial from Suzanne. She says, Tony, like you, I was on the Howard campus that Friday afternoon. I, a white faculty member, came back across Park Road in a VW Beetle, of course, to be met at 14th Street with smoke, broken glass, and police and riot gear. My feeling was not fear, but something along the lines of, it's happened. That was very, very interesting experience there. All right, I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. So Suzanne keeps going. She says, to me, the similarities between 1968 and 2020 are superficial. The looting and violence then came from the inside. What I saw at DuPont in the looted shops was organized by cell phones between vans and adventitious, born of the distraction of what was going on 1 mile south. The events are not comparable because we are not. P.S. I was told by my students that Stokely, whoops, oh, I need a little thing to disappear there. I was told by my students that Stokely came to campus that afternoon, but wasn't generally recognized. Another era at Howard. You're right, though, it never was the same. So thanks for that, Suzanne. That was very interesting.
Stokely Carmichael was on campus. He briefly.
Okay. All right. And I keep scrolling down. In 1968, was there as much violence and opposition directed at the police as there was in 2020? For example, such a large part of the graffiti around DC that appeared in 2020 was anti-police rhetoric.
Yes.
Yes.
When they would show up, people would throw bottles at them and rocks. When the firemen came to try to put out the fire, they would throw bottles and rocks at them. Even though the police, from what I can figure, were instructed not to be too violent and aggressive, to stand back a bit. They still were there. People expressed their anger at them. And yeah, they took some hard hits.
In the community hearings afterwards, a lot of people, talked about their grievances with the police.
Yeah.
In 1968, there was a huge emphasis on restraint. I'm not saying that was perfectly followed. And, tear gas was considered a form of restraint. So I think that perception has changed quite a bit since. But, in Detroit in 1967, over 40 people died. And the majority were from bullets, from National Guards members or police officers. And so after that, there was a huge emphasis on restraint and the idea that that wasn't acceptable. And so by comparison, I think there were over, I think it's like over 10,000 rounds of ammunition that was fired by federal troops or policemen in Detroit, and in DC there was less than 15. So it gives you kind of, and once again, not that there wasn't other forms of brutality, but there was at least top-down orders and emphasis on restraint.
Kyla and Tony, you've both talked about how kind of our narrative of 1968, or the kind of the traditional narrative, is that the uprisings were terrible and the consequences were terrible, and it just had just devastating repercussions for the city. But Kyla, you make a really good case for the fact that there were that traditional narrative should be disrupted, and there were good things that came out of those series of events. And so as we close out, I'd like for you to speak to that, and perhaps also hope for our present moment, and the good, the change, the progress, the activism, the advocacy that is coming out of the Black Lives Movement today. Kyla, why don't you start? Yeah.
Okay. To be clear, I don't want to minimize the damage that happened or the very real pain that resulted. I just think that has been the dominant narrative, and it's not good for that to be the only or primary narrative coming out of 1968. Yeah. I think that 1968 is also about activism and grief and an outpouring of people saying that this isn't right, and these are problems that have happened for decades, and we're not going to take this oppression anymore. And I think that needs to be remembered too. And I also think the way that DC citizens carried those feelings out into policy and into a plan for how to remake the district, specifically to address the concerns that came out and were identified in 1968. So I think that remembering, the multiple legacies, and not only centering this idea that the city was destroyed, people fled, and we've only come back since gentrification. You know, DC wasn't lying in wait for luxury coffee shops and apartments. People went to work and were working to create a better city in the aftermath.
Yeah. That's a great summary. Tony?
The riots themselves were terrible.
Mm-hmm.
They were terrible. To stand there and just see the destruction was just terrible. There was nothing good, nothing good I could gather from that experience there. People lost their homes, their businesses, didn't come back for years, decades, didn't come back. And it wasn't, as I mentioned, people felt they were burning their homes. They felt they were burning some dilapidated place they were forced to live in, and what the hell, you know. But it's terrible. I mean, it is horrible having people throw stuff at you, being shot at, you know. That's bad stuff. That's it. You wish you'd never, but you understand it. You know, it comes from being mistreated for so long, being angry for so long. And folks couldn't go much further than where the army and the police had them go. And that was primarily in their own community. So they tore up what was in front. But you know, hope to never have to go through that again. You know, the problems can be fixed, so people don't need to feel. Police have to stop killing Black people, killing Black men. One last, someone asked me after the Floyd incident, well, now you see the police, you know, they saw what, they won't do that anymore, right? The next day, they pushed some man down, almost caused him a concussion, shooting people in the back. The next day, you know. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be cynical and negative, but that's the kind of stuff that has to stop. That stops, then you got a chance of stopping what happened in '68 and a few months ago here in Washington again. You got a chance, but you got to fix it. If you ignore it, sweep it under the rug, don't want to talk about it, face it, it's going to come back and haunt you. It's got to. Yeah. It's just hard to watch other people being mistreated. And that's what happens. And you see it and you think, you know, at some point you got to do something. And when you got to do something, this is what results.
That's right. Okay, Kyla, I'll give you a final word and I'll wrap up.
I think Tony has the last word there.
Okay, fair enough.
I gotta say how much, Kyla, I've enjoyed getting to know you and benefiting from all the research and the work you've done. I want to thank you for that.
Likewise, thank you so much.
Well, it's been really just wonderful to see you in conversation with one another, and it really is a beautiful thing. So thank you for sharing that with us. So I'll go ahead and wrap up. So I've got a whole bunch of little housekeeping items here. So I just want to say, if you're interested in this topic and based on the questions, many of you indeed are, I really invite you to check out our website, dchistory.org, under education, our context for today's series of resources that expands on what Tony and Kyla have shared today. There's some really great readings there, to even short ones, that will help you kind of deepen what you've learned. This program will be up on YouTube along with closed captioning in a few days as well, and feel free to share those links with your networks. So funding for this program was provided from the Kiplinger Foundation, as well as from Humanities DC and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the CARES Act of 2020. If you enjoyed this program and got something from it, and you didn't make a contribution when you registered, please do consider making a gift on our website at dchistory.org. We'll be back in September with another Zoom program. To get those announcements, sign up for a biweekly email or check us out on social. You'll find us at DC History. I want to thank you very sincerely for joining this conversation. We want to know how you liked it. So watch your inbox for a link to our post-event survey. Kyla and Tony, I really can't thank you enough. Your comments today have been informative and moving and meaningful. And that's truly a gift. And lastly, I want to acknowledge the amazing team that produced this program. Maggie Downing, Katrina Ingram, and Jane Levy. I can't appreciate you guys enough. All right, thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening.